Much. I'm Paul Allen. I'm native of Penrith. I've studied electrical engineering and worked for 32 years at the Centre for Alternative Technology. And since 2007, I've been working on a project called Zero Carbon Britain that models an endpoint of what it would be like if we rose to the climate emergency, to open conversations about what that needs. And we look at transport, buildings, energy, and food and land use. And by integrating food and land use into the model and not thinking of it separately from the rest of the shift that needs to happen, we can reveal some interesting things. All of what I'm about to talk about, you can download for free from cat.org.uk. It's the report Rising to the Climate Emergency, and this is chapter 3.6, land use. And yeah, we need to act now. It's a climate emergency. To deal with that question, the best way of answering that question is to deal with the climate emergency, because if we don't, all of those things are going to get worse. So we must act now to avoid the crisis. So land use practice at the moment is not currently sustainable, and it's increasingly economically unstable. And at the same time, we're facing a biodiversity emergency, which includes things like pollinators, so we can't ignore that. But there are ideas which we think can begin to help us rethink how we relate food and land use to the rest of the change. And firstly is the recognition of the biodiversity emergency. Nature has its own intrinsic worth. I don't talk about environment at all, because environment's out there and other and separate from me. We are nature, urgently trying to protect our own systems. So we have to rethink land use from the point of view of the biodiversity emergency. We have no choice but to do that. But also land use creates about 10% of UK emissions. So if we have a government target of net zero emissions, we have to rethink land use for that reason. But if we're rethinking land use, there's also opportunities. If we're rethinking our energy supply, then there's all sorts of opportunities for farmers. I know the wind farm that we installed on the Jones farm, probably about 20 years ago, has really transformed that farm in terms of its stability. But also thinking about land use, we can think about biomass, we can think about capturing carbon. There's an incredible process on the up and up at the moment in dealing with the peaks with big renewables. You can take the peak electricity when nobody wants it at 2 o'clock in the morning and split water into hydrogen and oxygen, and then capture carbon from the atmosphere and add that to the hydrogen to make carbon neutral synthetic methane that can go into existing power stations, existing gas grid. There's all sorts of emerging opportunities for land use. But we also need to increase natural carbon capture by revitalizing peat bogs, by doubling the forest cover in the UK, so that the natural systems are capturing much more carbon. But we also need to rethink land use from the point of view of diets. Now, if we think about, there's 4 types of food: starchy foods, high protein foods, high fat sugars and salts, and fruit and veg. And we look at what the Eat Well guide is, what we should be eating. We should be eating 5% high fats, sugars. We're actually eating 43%. We should be eating 39% fruit and veg. We're only eating 9%. So by shifting our diets, we can shift the pressure on the land. And absolutely, we need to rethink waste. And I think that needs to become like a cultural shift, like we've seen about race, gender, cigarettes, plastic, and really remove the sort of, help people recognize that it's a very wasteful and bad thing to do. But basically, if we switch to a healthier diet, like we suggest in the Zero Carbon Britain scenario, which is a provocation to open conversations, we can actually free up lots of land. If we look back at land use and we go up to, would it be Carlisle or Lancaster, and go to the museum, Cumbria Museum, and look at the old maps of the farms around the Lake District, around Penrith, around Kendal. And the maps show that it was a lot more diverse farming in our farming heritage, in the history of farming. We were producing a lot wider range of different crops. But if we switch to eating the right amount of high fats and sugars, particularly meat, we don't need as much grassland. So we can use some of that grassland for cropland, for growing other types of crops and pulses. And if any of the land is associated with carbon capture or renewable energy, there are very powerful income streams associated with that. And we can also use land to increase nature's ability to capture carbon. And if we do that, we'll be paid for that. We could double the forest area of the UK to more like the European average, so we can increase the use of wood products in the building trade and restore well over 50% of all the peatlands that were drained. Similarly, we can grow crops that we need to capture the carbon, to add to the hydrogen, to make synthetic gas, which can then go in the existing gas grid, can be stored up over the summer, used during the winter to be sure that all of the gaps in the big renewables can be filled by the combined cycle power stations. So basically we can switch from a land use system which has been driven really by subsidies designed by a government that really isn't climate aware, to a way that we can use land smarter for using the fuel to fill the gaps between the big renewables, but also enhancing our ability to capture carbon with natural systems. Because there's too much reliance in scenarios, even the NFU scenario, on these devices that will be invented and installed in 2035, 2040 that will pull carbon out of the atmosphere. Now they're going to be expensive to build, and they're not proven at scale, and they're not proven at cost. So I think it's sort of passing the buck to a future generation to deal with the emissions. We need to make the changes that we need to see now. So if we do the sorts of things outlined in the scenario, we show how we can get to net zero emissions. But there's all sorts of multi-solving co-benefits that happen. I mean, one of my most strangest experiences was in the local supermarket where I came across this packet of radishes from Peru. And looking at these lovely little red radishes and just thought, these grew in the ground in Peru and they've been flown here. We can grow radishes anywhere in Kendal or Penrith. So we can stop importing the food that we can grow here. Now, if we can say, yes, we can solve a lot of problems, but sorry, there's no more chocolate, there's no more coffee, there's no more tea, I don't think people would be sold on that. So we can still import the things that we can't grow here, but ensure that the growers get a fair price. But the UK could become a lot more resilient in food production. And sort of finally, there's all sorts of income and employment opportunities in making the UK much more self-reliant in the food that we eat and it can grow. And we can talk to the indigenous wisdom of the farming community. We can look through old maps, we can talk to old farmers who remember farming in the 1930s and learn from that indigenous wisdom that it was a much more diverse thing in the past. But that doesn't mean giving up tractors. We can have light, smart electric tractors powered by renewables. We can relocalize supply chains. We've seen big shifts around Machynlleth. We've seen a land army form and go off and work with farmers to produce more food locally. And there's a big, I suppose, sort of social prescription benefit as well for people who are just feel disconnected and lost to become part of growing teams and land armies. On-farm local renewable energy, particularly if you can sell that at a better price to the consumers around you rather than just sell it to the grid, as the Energy Local project in Bethesda shows. We can increase the natural carbon capture of our system, so we're actually sucking down more carbon. Increase forestry and wood products is jobs and employment. And there's all sorts of innovative new businesses will spin out of this.
So, less than a minute left, Paul.
Well, just to say really, we've got, the whole report is written in a way that we're very strict with ourselves. It's fully referenced, but it's written in language that an intelligent 14-year-old could understand. It's called Zero Carbon Britain, Rising to the Climate Emergency. It's totally free to download from cat.org.uk, and you can click on social media tools, get little videos about it, so you don't have to read it all. It's all there as a support tool for the climate emergency assemblies and citizens' assemblies and juries that are happening across the UK. And we're not saying it's the only way to do it, but we're showing one possible end scenario that can open some important conversations. But I think the key thing is that we can't just talk about land on its own. We need to talk about land in the context of energy, in the context of buildings, building materials, and just siloing things off, you miss the opportunities to multi-solve. Thank you very much.